They called it reckless when the telegraph operator started piling fieldstone against the south wall of a timber yurt in the Green Mountains. Winter was 6 weeks out, and he was building something nobody in the valley had tried before. -20 degrees Fahrenheit was the test that January, and the traveling insurance adjuster stood on the porch that October afternoon and said it plain. "You'll be lucky to make it." The builder just nodded and kept mixing mud mortar with wood ash and straw, pressing it into the joints between stones that would become a south-facing thermal mass sun wall. The problem wasn't the cold outside. It was keeping heat inside when fuel ran short and the stove went out. The builder was a telegraph operator with practical hands, the kind who could splice wire in a blizzard and still make the morning shift. He'd worked the line for a decade, watched fuel bills climb every winter, watched neighbors burn through cordwood faster than they could split it. He knew Morse code, and he knew numbers. And the numbers said that even a well-built cabin lost 60% of its heat through the walls and roof. So he started sketching plans during the slow hours at the telegraph office. Plans for a structure that could hold warmth without burning through a month's wages in firewood. By late summer, he'd filed the claim on a hillside lot 2 miles from the village center and started hauling timber. The design borrowed from the steps, a round timber frame with a low conical roof. But he added a double-door airlock porch on the north side and a wide earth berm on the east and west flanks. The innovation was the south wall. Instead of more timber, he built a fieldstone mass wall 3 feet thick, angled to catch the low winter sun. The idea was simple. Stone soaks up heat during the day and radiates it back at night. The thicker the stone, the longer the release. He'd read about it in an engineering journal that came through the telegraph office, an article about passive solar heating in high desert climates. He figured, if it worked in Nevada, it might work in Vermont. The county office clerk thought he was out of his mind. He started in August. The timber came from a small stand of spruce on the north slope. Trees he felled himself with a 2-man saw borrowed from a neighbor. He shaped the vertical posts with a draw knife and set them in a circle 16 feet across, braced with horizontal rings every 4 feet up. The roof frame went on in sections, each rafter notched to fit the ring beam at the top. By mid-September, the timber skeleton stood complete, and he started on the stone wall. The fieldstone came from an old fence line a half-mile uphill. Stones already weathered and sized, hauled down in a borrowed cart 2 loads a day. He mixed mortar in a wooden trough, ash and clay and straw, the same mix settlers had used for 100 years. The wall went up slow, 1 course a day, each stone set level and the joints packed tight. The airlock porch was functional, not fancy. 2 doors separated by a 6-foot vestibule, both hung on iron strap hinges he'd traded for at the village smithy. The idea was to trap cold air in the vestibule, so it never reached the main room. He insulated the outer door with a quilt stuffed with wool scraps, and he built a small overhang above it to keep snow from piling against the threshold. Inside the main room, he hung wool blankets like interior wall tapestries, salvaged from estate sales and farm auctions, layered 2 deep on the north and east walls. The blankets added another layer of dead airspace between the timber and the living area, cutting wind infiltration. It looked rough, but the physics worked. By October, the stone wall stood 7 feet high and capped with a timber lintel. He left 4 window openings in the stone, each 2 feet wide, and he built wooden frames to hold panes of salvaged glass. The windows faced due south, angled to catch the low arc of the winter sun. During the day, the sun would pour through the glass and heat the stone. At night, he planned to cover the windows with quilted panels to trap the warmth inside. The principle was thermal mass storage. Stone holds heat far longer than wood or air. A 3-foot thick wall could store enough daytime solar gain to radiate warmth for 10 or 12 hours after sunset. That was the theory. The test would come when the temperature dropped and the stove ran out of fuel. He chinked the gaps in the timber walls with moss and clay, packed tight with a flat stick. He insulated the low conical roof with a layer of sod, cut in strips from the hillside, and laid grass side up over a base of split shingles. The sod added mass and insulation, and it shed water better than bare wood. He vented the roof peak with a small chimney cowl, adjustable with a rope pull, so he could control the draft without climbing outside in a storm. The whole structure looked odd, a round timber yurt with a stone face and a grassy hat. But every detail had a reason. He wasn't building for looks. He was building to survive a Green Mountains winter on a telegrapher's income. The village watched with a mix of curiosity and doubt. A few neighbors stopped by on Sunday afternoons to see the progress, and most of them shook their heads. One older farmer said stone walls belonged in root cellars, not living quarters. Another said the round shape would trap snow and collapse the roof. A widow from the next hollow asked if he planned to live like a Mongolian tribesman, and he just smiled and said he planned to live warm. The skepticism didn't bother him. He'd worked through enough winters to know that fuel cost was the killer, and if he could cut his wood consumption by half, the odd looks would be worth it. The traveling insurance adjuster showed up in mid-October to assess the property for a policy, took one look at the stone wall and the sod roof, and quoted a rate triple the standard cabin premium. The builder declined and kept working. He built a small cast-iron stove from a salvaged ship's galley unit, mounted it on a stone pad in the center of the main room, and ran the stovepipe up through the roof peak. The stove was efficient, but small, designed to burn a minimal amount of wood and radiate heat in all directions. He positioned it so the pipe wouldn't interfere with the roof vent cowl, and he insulated the pipe pass-through with a metal collar and fire clay. The stone pad under the stove added thermal mass at floor level, another heat sink that would soak up warmth and release it slowly. Every piece of the system fed into the same goal: maximize heat retention, minimize fuel use. By late October, the cabin was weather-tight, and the first light snows dusted the hillside. He moved in on November 1st. The interior was spare: a narrow cot against the north wall, a small table and 2 chairs near the stove, a shelf for books and telegraph equipment, and a row of hooks for coats and tools. The wool blankets on the walls gave the space a layered, insulated feel, and the stone wall dominated the south side, a mass of gray fieldstone with 4 bright windows that let in the low autumn sun. He tested the stove that first night, burning a modest fire of split oak, and the cabin warmed quickly. The stone wall soaked up the radiant heat, and by midnight the stove had burned down to coals, but the room still held warmth. He woke at dawn to find the interior temperature comfortable, the stone wall still radiating faint heat from the previous evening's fire. It was a promising start. The first real test came in mid-November, when a cold front dropped the overnight temperature to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. He burned a normal evening fire, banked the coals at 10 o'clock, and covered the south windows with the quilted panels he'd sewn from old mattress ticking and wool batting. The panels hung on wooden frames that slid into slots above each window, creating an insulated barrier between the glass and the room. By morning the stove was cold, but the cabin interior measured 42 degrees, a 61-degree differential from the outside air. He hadn't burned any wood after 10 o'clock, and the retained heat from the stone wall had kept the space above freezing for 8 hours. That's when he knew the system worked. The stone mass was doing exactly what he'd calculated. storing daytime solar gain and releasing it overnight. He tracked the data with the same precision he used on telegraph logs. Every morning he recorded the overnight low, the interior temperature at dawn, and the amount of wood burned. By December, he had 2 months of measurements, showing consistent performance. On nights when the outside temperature dropped below zero, the cabin interior never fell below 38 degrees, even with no fire after midnight. The stone wall and the insulated envelope were carrying the thermal load. He calculated that he was burning 80% less wood than a conventional cabin of the same size would require. That translated to real savings. A cord of split oak that would last a neighbor 2 weeks was stretching to 8 weeks in his system. The math was undeniable, but the neighbors still called it a gamble. Then January showed up. The month opened with clear skies and bitter cold. The kind of cold that made metal brittle and froze breath into ice crystals before it hit the ground. The builder kept his routine. Morning fire to warm the stone wall. Let the sun do the work through the day. Modest evening fire. Bank the coals. Cover the windows. Let the stored heat carry the night. The system hummed along through the first 2 weeks of January without trouble. He burned less than a quarter cord of wood and the cabin stayed comfortable. The telegraph office was colder than his home, and he started bringing an extra wool shirt to work. The neighbors stopped asking questions. Most of them figured he'd gotten lucky with a mild start to winter. They were waiting for the real cold, the cold that broke systems and exposed flaws. The crisis came on January 18th. The builder woke before dawn to find the stove completely cold, the fire out, and the cabin interior measuring 34 degrees. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the smokehouse. He'd built a small smokehouse outbuilding 30 yards downhill, a timber shed with a stone firebox for curing meat, and the draft had failed overnight. Smoke had backed up into the shed and ruined a week's worth of pork and venison. He spent the morning trying to clear the chimney, realized the damper mechanism had frozen shut, and had to dismantle the entire flue to fix it. By the time he got back to the main cabin, it was mid-afternoon, and he'd missed the warmest part of the day. The stone wall hadn't received its usual solar charge. He started a fire in the stove at 4 o'clock, but the temperature was already dropping outside, and the wind was picking up from the northwest. By 6 o'clock, the thermometer on the porch read -15 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. He burned a normal evening fire, banked the coals at 9, and covered the south windows as usual. Then, he made a mistake. He'd been so focused on fixing the smokehouse that he forgot to split more firewood, and the indoor woodpile was down to 3 small logs. Normally that would be fine for a night, but this wasn't a normal night. The wind was driving the temperature lower by the hour, and the stone wall hadn't stored its full daytime charge. He knew he was going into the coldest night of the year with a deficit. By midnight, the outside temperature hit -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The builder woke to check the stove and found it down to ash. No coals left to revive. The 3 remaining logs wouldn't last until dawn, and he wasn't about to go outside in -20 wind to split more in the dark. So he made a choice. He let the fire die. He pulled every blanket he owned onto the cot, layered his wool coat over the pile, and settled in to see what the stone wall could do on its own. The interior temperature was 40 degrees when he lay down. He figured it would drop to freezing by dawn, maybe lower. He'd know soon enough whether the thermal mass system was real or just theory. He didn't sleep much. The wind hammered the north side of the cabin, rattling the airlock doors and whistling through the roof vent. The cold crept in through every gap, testing the chinking in the insulation. He could feel the temperature dropping by the hour, a slow, steady decline that no amount of blankets could stop. By 3 in the morning, his breath was visible in the dark. He checked the interior thermometer with a match, 36 degrees. By 4:30, it was 34. The stone wall was still radiating warmth, but it was losing the fight. He lay there in the dark and wondered if the insurance adjuster had been right after all. You'll be lucky to make it. Dawn came slow and gray. He climbed out of the blankets at 6 o'clock and checked the thermometer again. 32 degrees inside. The outside temperature was still -20. The stove had been cold for 7 hours. No fire, no backup heat, and the cabin interior had only dropped 8 degrees. The stone wall had carried the night. It hadn't kept the cabin warm, but it had kept it above freezing in conditions that would have turned a conventional cabin into an icebox. That's the difference. A wooden cabin with a dead stove at -20 would drop to 0 or below within 3 hours. This cabin, with its 3-foot-thick thermal mass wall, had held at 32 degrees for 7 hours with no active heat source. The stored solar gain from the previous afternoon, even diminished, had been enough to buffer the interior against a 52-degree temperature differential. He started a fire immediately, coaxed the frozen kindling into flame with a splash of kerosene, and fed the stove until it roared. Within an hour, the cabin was back to 50 degrees, and by mid-morning, the sun was pouring through the south windows and recharging the stone wall. He spent the rest of the day splitting firewood and restocking the indoor pile, and that evening he burned a full fire to bring the stone mass back up to capacity. But the test was over. The system had proven itself under the worst conditions he was likely to face. A dead stove at -20 degrees, and the cabin had stayed above freezing on thermal mass alone. The 80% fuel efficiency wasn't theory anymore. It was measured fact. Word spread fast in a small valley. The builder mentioned the overnight test to a neighbor at the village store, and by the end of the week, 3 families had walked up the hillside to see the cabin for themselves. They stood in the main room and touched the stone wall, felt the retained warmth radiating from the fieldstone even hours after sunset. They looked at the wool blankets on the walls, the quilted window panels, the sod roof, the double-door airlock. One farmer asked how much firewood he'd burned since November. The builder showed him the log. Less than 2 cords total through 2.5 months of winter. The farmer did the math in his head and went quiet. His own cabin had burned through 4 cords in the same period, and it was still cold enough to freeze water overnight. The traveling insurance adjuster came back in February, unannounced, and asked to see the interior. The builder let him in and showed him the temperature log. 2 months of data proving consistent overnight performance, even in sub-zero conditions. The adjuster examined the stone wall, the airlock, the insulation, and the roof. Then he pulled out his rate book and revised the policy quote down to standard cabin pricing. He didn't apologize for the earlier assessment, but he didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. A structure that could hold heat for 7 hours with no fire at -20 degrees was not a gamble. It was engineering. By March, 2 more families in the valley had started their own stone wall projects, adapting the design to fit conventional cabins. One neighbor built a smaller thermal mass wall on the south side of his existing structure, stacking fieldstone 3 feet thick and adding 2 windows for solar gain. Another dug out the north side of his cabin and bermed it with earth, then insulated the roof with sod. The builder helped where he could, lending tools and sharing measurements, but he didn't charge for advice. The principle was simple enough that anyone with basic carpentry skills could replicate it, and the materials were mostly salvage and fieldstone. The innovation wasn't proprietary. It was survival technique. The telegraph operator kept detailed records through the rest of the winter. By April, when the last hard freeze passed, he'd burned a total of 3.5 cords of firewood to heat the cabin through 5 months of Green Mountain's winter. A neighbor with a comparable-sized cabin had burned 16 cords. The fuel efficiency was close to 80%, just as he'd calculated. The stone wall system worked because it didn't fight the physics of heat loss. It accepted that heat would escape through walls and roof, and it compensated by storing enough daytime solar energy to offset the overnight loss. The result was a structure that required minimal active heating and could survive a stove failure without dropping below freezing. The spring thaw revealed the structure's durability. The sod roof had shed water and snow without leaking. The earth berms had settled firm without eroding, and the fieldstone wall showed no cracks or shifting. The builder inspected every joint and found the mortar intact. The stones locked solid. The timber frame had flexed slightly under snow load, but had returned to true once the weight lifted. He replaced a few sections of chinking where the clay had dried and crumbled, and he retarred the roof vent flashing, but otherwise, the cabin required no major repairs. The double-door airlock had kept ice and drafts out of the main room all winter, and the wool blankets on the walls had stayed dry and effective. The system had proven itself not just thermally, but structurally, surviving a full Vermont winter without failure. By summer, 7 families in the valley had incorporated some version of the south-facing thermal mass wall into their homes. The designs varied. Some used stone, some used brick salvaged from old chimneys. One used stacked fieldstone chinked with lime mortar. But the principle was the same. Thick south-facing mass to store solar heat. Insulated envelope to retain it. Minimal active heating to supplement overnight loss. The fuel savings were real and measurable. Families that had burned 6 or 8 cords a winter were cutting their consumption in half. The innovation didn't eliminate the need for firewood, but it drastically reduced the volume required, freeing up time and money for other necessities. The builder continued working the telegraph line and living in the timber yurt through the next winter. The second season confirmed what the first had proven. The system was reliable, efficient, and replicable. He burned 3 cords of wood, slightly less than the first year, and the overnight temperatures inside never dropped below 35 degrees, even on the coldest nights. He refined a few details, added a second layer of wool blankets to the north wall, built a small reflector panel to bounce additional sunlight onto the stone wall during low-angle winter days, and improved the damper control on the roof vent to reduce heat loss during high winds. Each adjustment was minor, but together they pushed the fuel efficiency higher without adding complexity. Other innovations followed in the valley. One neighbor built a small root cellar into the earth berm on the north side of his cabin, using the stable ground temperature to store vegetables through the winter. Another family insulated their cabin floor with sawdust packed between joists, cutting heat loss through the floorboards. A third household built a smaller version of the airlock porch, just a single extra door with a vestibule, and reported a noticeable reduction in drafts. The telegraph operator's design had sparked a broader shift in how people thought about winter heating. The focus moved from burning more fuel to retaining more heat, and the results showed in woodpile sizes and household budgets. The third winter brought a late-season blizzard in March, the kind that dumped 2 feet of snow overnight and shut down roads for 3 days. The builder woke the morning after the storm to find the airlock porch buried under a drift that reached the roof eave. He spent an hour digging out the outer door, then another hour clearing the path to the woodpile. The interior temperature had dropped to 40 degrees overnight, but the cabin was dry and the stone wall was still radiating stored heat from the previous evening's fire. He restarted the stove, pulled the quilted panels off the south windows, and let the morning sun do the rest. By noon, the cabin was back to 55 degrees, and the stone wall was warm to the touch. The blizzard had tested the structure's snow load capacity and draft resistance, and it had passed without damage or discomfort. He documented the event in his temperature log, noting that the 2-foot snow load on the sod roof had actually improved insulation temporarily, creating an additional layer of dead air space under the snowpack. The airlock porch had prevented the drift from reaching the main door, and the earth berms had shed the snow load without shifting. The round timber frame had distributed the weight evenly, avoiding the concentrated stress points that often caused conventional cabin roofs to sag or crack. The builder realized that the yurt-inspired design wasn't just efficient for heating. It was structurally sound for heavy snow, a secondary benefit he hadn't fully anticipated when he started the build. By the spring of the third year, the telegraph operator had become a quiet authority on passive solar heating in the Green Mountains. He didn't advertise his expertise, but neighbors sought him out for advice when planning new builds or renovations. He helped a young couple design a stone wall addition for their cabin, walked an older farmer through the math on earth berm insulation, and sketched window placement diagrams for a widow who wanted to reduce her firewood costs. He never charged for the consultations. The knowledge was practical, not proprietary, and the more people who adopted the techniques, the more resilient the valley became against fuel shortages and harsh winters. The system's reputation spread beyond the immediate valley. A county extension agent visited in the summer of the third year, interviewed the builder, and wrote a short report on the thermal mass wall technique for a regional agriculture bulletin. The report included basic measurements, material lists, and a simplified diagram of the south-facing wall layout. It didn't name the builder or specify the location, but it described the performance data: 80% fuel reduction, overnight temperature stability in sub-zero conditions, and structural durability through 3 full winters. The bulletin circulated through Vermont and into New Hampshire, reaching homesteaders and small farmers who were looking for ways to cut heating costs without sacrificing comfort. The innovation didn't become a widespread movement, but it didn't need to. The handful of families who adopted the thermal mass wall technique saw immediate, measurable results, and that was enough to validate the principle. The builder's design was never patented, never commercialized, never scaled beyond small-scale replication. It remained what it had always been: a practical solution to a specific problem, built with salvaged materials and common sense, proven through 3 winters of real-world testing. The technique worked because it respected the physics of heat storage and the limits of available fuel. It didn't try to outsmart the cold. It just managed it better. The telegraph operator lived in the timber yurt for another 5 years, through the rest of the 1930s and into the early 1940s. He maintained the structure carefully, replacing worn chinking, retarring the roof vent, and adding a second layer of sod to the roof after the 4th winter. The cabin aged well, the fieldstone wall settling into a solid mass that radiated warmth reliably every winter. He burned an average of 3 cords per season, far below the valley norm, and his fuel costs stayed low even when firewood prices rose during the war years. The savings gave him financial margin to invest in other improvements: a better saw, a small library of technical books, and eventually a modest addition to the cabin for storage. The neighbors who had built their own thermal mass walls reported similar long-term success. One family tracked their fuel use over 5 years and documented a 68% reduction compared to their pre-renovation baseline. Another household expanded their stone wall to include a small greenhouse lean-to on the south side, using the same passive solar principle to extend their growing season into late autumn. A third family added a water tank behind their stone wall, letting the sun heat water during the day for evening washing and bathing. The core innovation, the thick south-facing thermal mass, adapted to different applications while maintaining its fundamental efficiency. The principle was universal, even if the implementations varied. The technique began to fade in the late 1940s as kerosene heaters and eventually oil furnaces became more affordable and accessible in rural Vermont. The convenience of fuel delivery and automatic heating outweighed the labor of maintaining a passive solar system, and younger families started building conventional homes with central heating. The thermal mass walls didn't disappear immediately, but they stopped being replicated. By the early 1950s, most of the original builds were still standing and functional, but new construction had moved on to modern heating methods. The innovation became a historical curiosity, remembered by a few older residents, but largely forgotten by the broader community. The builder kept his timber yurt through the transition. He never installed oil heat, never upgraded to a furnace, never abandoned the stone wall system. He burned wood through the winter and relied on the thermal mass to carry the overnight hours, and the cabin stayed warm and dry year after year. He continued working the telegraph line until the system was phased out in the late 1940s, then transitioned to small-scale carpentry and repair work in the village. The cabin remained his primary residence, a testament to the durability of salvaged materials and practical design. The stone wall still radiated warmth in January. The sod roof still shed snow without leaking, and the double-door airlock still kept drafts out of the main room. The innovation's legacy wasn't measured in widespread adoption or published papers. It was measured in cordwood saved, in families who stayed warm through hard winters without draining their savings, in a handful of structures that outlasted the fashion for modern heating and kept performing long after the builders had moved on. The south-facing thermal mass sun wall worked because it was simple, replicable, and grounded in physics that didn't change with trends or technology. It required labor and attention, but it delivered results that could be measured in degrees and cords and dollars. That was enough. The winter of 1949 brought another hard freeze, temperatures dropping to -18 degrees for 3 consecutive nights. The builder was in his 50s by then, still living in the timber yurt, still burning minimal wood and relying on the stone wall to carry the thermal load. The cabin performed exactly as it had in the first winter. Overnight temperatures held at 34 degrees with no fire after midnight. The stone mass radiating stored heat through the cold hours, the insulated envelope preventing rapid loss. He woke each morning to a cold stove and a livable interior, started a modest fire, and let the sun recharge the stone wall through the day. The system required no repairs, no adjustments, no innovation. It just worked, year after year, winter after winter. By the early 1950s, the builder had become one of the last holdouts still using passive solar heating in the valley. Most neighbors had switched to oil furnaces or kerosene heaters, and the thermal mass walls built in the late 1930s were either abandoned or converted to conventional heating. A few families kept their stone walls but added backup furnaces for convenience, and the walls became decorative rather than functional. The builder didn't judge the shift. He understood the appeal of automatic heating, the luxury of waking to a warm house without having to start a fire. But he also understood the cost, both financial and practical, of depending on fuel delivery and mechanical systems. He kept his stone wall and his firewood, and he stayed warm. The cabin stood through the 1950s without major repairs. The fieldstone wall remained solid, The sod roof aged but functional. The timber frame straight and true. The builder replaced sections of chinking as needed, retarred the roof vent every few years, and kept the wool blankets in good condition. The structure didn't require elaborate maintenance because it had been built correctly from the start. Solid foundation, quality materials, careful joinery, and a design that worked with the environment instead of fighting it. The thermal mass wall didn't wear out. Stone doesn't fatigue, doesn't rot, doesn't lose its capacity to store and radiate heat. The system was as effective in year 20 as it had been in year 1. The innovation's proof wasn't in its spread or its legacy. It was in the builder's continued survival and comfort through 2 decades of Green Mountain's winters, burning less than 4 cords a year, while neighbors burned 10 or 12. It was in the interior temperature logs, showing consistent overnight stability, even in the coldest conditions. It was in the absence of frozen pipes, the lack of emergency fuel runs, the steady warmth that allowed normal life to continue regardless of the weather outside. The south-facing thermal mass sun wall wasn't a revolution. It was a solution, practical and durable, that worked because the physics were sound and the execution was careful. The builder continued living in the cabin into the early 1950s, maintaining the structure and refining his understanding of the thermal mass system. He kept detailed records of every winter, tracking fuel use, overnight temperatures, and weather conditions. The data accumulated into a comprehensive picture of how passive solar heating performed across different scenarios: mild winters, harsh winters, early cold snaps, late season storms. The results were consistent. The stone wall delivered predictable, reliable heat retention as long as it received adequate daytime solar exposure. The system had no moving parts, no points of failure, no dependency on external supply chains. It was resilient by design. The handful of families who had built their own thermal mass walls in the late 1930s reported similar long-term performance. One neighbor kept his stone wall active through the 1940s and into the 50s, even after adding an oil furnace as backup. He used the furnace sparingly, relying on the stone wall for baseline heating and only firing the furnace during extreme cold or extended cloudy periods. Another family passed their cabin to the next generation, and the new owners continued using the thermal mass system without modification. The walls built in the 30s were still standing and functional 20 years later, proof that the design wasn't just efficient, but durable. The principle behind the south-facing thermal mass sun wall was never complicated. Thick stone absorbs heat during the day, releases it at night. Insulated envelope prevents rapid loss. Minimal active heating supplements the stored energy. The challenge wasn't understanding the physics. It was committing to the labor and the material investment required to build a 3-foot thick stone wall, to insulate properly, to design window placement for maximum solar gain. Most people chose convenience over efficiency, and that was a rational decision given the availability of cheap fuel in the post-war years. But for those who built the walls, the choice paid off in lower costs, greater resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of living in a structure that worked with the environment instead of consuming resources to fight it. The builders stayed in the timber yurt through the rest of the 1950s, through the shift to modern heating and the gradual abandonment of passive solar techniques in the valley. He never wrote a book, never gave a formal presentation, never sought recognition for the innovation. He just lived in the cabin he'd built, burned 3 cords a winter, and maintained the stone wall that kept him warm. The structure aged gracefully, the fieldstone settling into a permanent mass, the sod roof compacting into a tight insulating layer, the timber frame weathering to a silvered gray. The cabin became a fixture on the hillside, a reminder of a time when fuel was scarce and ingenuity was necessary. The last major winter test came in 1958, when a late January cold snap pushed temperatures to -22 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 nights straight. The builder was approaching 60, still living alone in the timber yurt, still burning minimal wood and relying on the stone wall to carry the thermal load. The cabin performed without failure. Overnight temperatures held at 33 degrees with no fire after 10 o'clock. The stone mass radiating stored heat through the frozen hours, the insulated envelope preventing rapid loss. He woke each morning to a cold stove and a livable interior, started a fire, and let the sun recharge the stone wall. The system didn't break, didn't falter, didn't require emergency measures. It just worked, the same way it had worked for 20 years. By the end of the 1950s, the builder had proven beyond any doubt that a south-facing thermal mass sun wall could deliver consistent, reliable, efficient heating through Vermont winters. The data was incontrovertible. 20 years of temperature logs, fuel consumption records, and structural inspections showing no degradation or failure. The innovation had survived the worst weather the Green Mountains could deliver, and it had done so with minimal maintenance and no dependency on external supply chains. The principle was sound. The execution was durable. The results were measurable. That was the proof. The cabin stood as a quiet monument to practical engineering and frugal innovation, a structure built with salvaged materials and common sense that outlasted the fashion for passive solar heating and continued functioning long after most neighbors had switched to oil furnaces. The south-facing thermal mass sun wall wasn't a lost art or a forgotten secret. It was a proven technique that worked reliably when built correctly, and the builder had proven it through 2 decades of Green Mountains winters. The innovation didn't need validation or recognition. It had the only proof that mattered: a warm cabin, low fuel costs, and a structure that stood solid through every storm. The end.